is just a graph that shows the 4 panel board types for I-line side by side that gives you in the tables the maximum values, whether it be main lug, main breaker, or branch breaker, as well as dimensional information. So it's a nice snapshot that just compares the 4 panel board types against each other, so to speak. And you're going to, over your career with I-line, the 3 panel board types that you're going to use most often are the HCM, the HCP, and the HCR-U interiors. Those are what we call our conventional double row construction I-line interiors. So those are the 3, the HCM, the HCP, and the HCR-U are going to be the 3 that you're going to use most often for all of your I-line panel board applications. The HCP-SU fits kind of a unique application, kind of a niche application. And to kind of give you some information, that S, the HCP-SU, that S means it is single row construction. And when we talked about it briefly when we talked about column width panels back with NQ and NF, but when we talk about double row construction, that means breakers are mounted on the left-hand side of the bus stack, and they're also mounted on the right-hand side of the bus stack. You have 2 rows or a double row of breakers. With single row construction, you only have a single row of breakers. The breakers are only mounted on one side of the bus stack, and what that typically does with both column width and this HCP-SU is it minimizes the width of that enclosure. If you look at the table down at the bottom of this page, the HCP-SU is only 26 inches wide. So it's only 6 inches wider than an NQ or an NF panel. So it's a very relatively narrow enclosure for I-line construction. And we're going to go into a little more detail as to what niche market application that particular panel board fits. But I've grabbed these illustrations. These are straight out of the digest. If you go to section 9 and you go to the I-line section of the digest, these illustrations appear in the digest. And I've always told folks with I-line, if you've got a fairly good comfort level with what these illustrations are telling you, that's really your first step to being successful with I-line panels. So we're going to start with the HCM, which is the smallest conventional double row construction I-line panel that we manufacture. Notice at the bottom of that illustration, it's only 32 inches wide. If you go to the heart of the illustration, you see the vertical bus stack. That vertical bus stack is symmetrical. It's centered right in the middle of that illustration, and the illustration being the entire panel board. If you look at the very top, the verbiage above the illustration, it says 250 amp max, and it lists all of the breaker frame types that you can put into that HCM panel. So the J frame being the 250 amp max. If you look at the illustration down below the bus stack, it tells you that the maximum main lug and main breaker in that horizontal rectangle is 800 amp. So anything greater than 800 amp main lug or main breaker would go into one of the larger panels. And then if you notice over on the left-hand side where the arrows are, it says 1/2 total breaker mounting space on each side. And the reason that that illustration tells you that is when we actually go to the interior selection tables, the selection tables for the interiors talks about the total mounting space of the panel board. But we only can mount 1/2 of the breakers on the left side in this case, and the other half of the breakers on the right-hand side. So what this note with the arrows is reminding you of is when you look at the selection tables for the interior, you're going to see total, but you have to remember, be aware that you need to divide that number in half because 1/2 of the total mounting inches is on the left, the other half is on the right. Now, if you look at the smaller rectangles towards the top of the illustration, it shows all the breaker frame types. And one misconception is that a lot of people see we'll take, for example, the Q-frame breakers. They're shown at the top. And a lot of people think, oh, that means I can only mount that Q-frame breaker at the top. Or let's look at the J-frame. They're shown in the middle. Oh, that means I can only mount that J-frame in the middle of the panel. And that's not true. All that that's saying is those breakers will fit on that side of the panel. I can take a Q-frame breaker and mount it anywhere, top to bottom. I can take an H-frame breaker and mount it anywhere, top to bottom. And since this is a symmetrical interior, the left and the right-hand side are equal, so I can do that mounting any of these breakers top to bottom on either the left or the right-hand side. Jump over to the HCP-SU, and you notice now in this illustration the bus stack is shown clear offset to the right-hand side, and you see the breaker frame types in that single row construction. But look at the verbiage up at the very top above that illustration. 800 amp maximum main breaker, 600 amp maximum branch breaker, and then drop down to the dimensional information below. And just to remind you, 26 inches wide. The niche application that this panel board fits into is your customer doesn't have a whole lot of wall space. They have a very narrow opening. They only have 26 inches wide in their gear room. However, they have very high ampacity requirements. 800 amp maximum main breaker, 600 amp maximum branch breaker. So the unique application that this panel board fits into is where your customer doesn't have a whole lot of real estate. They can't go with one of these wider conventional enclosures. They need something narrow, yet they need a high ampacity application. But to my point, the three that you're going to use most often are going to be the HCM over here on the left-hand side, and then the HCP or the HCR-U. And as you look at both of these illustrations for the larger interiors, the first thing you notice is that bus stack is offset. And from this point forward, when I talk about these two interiors, I will not use the terms left and right side. I will use wide side and I will use narrow side, because in both of these illustrations, by offsetting that bus stack, we create a wide side that will accept those larger frame breakers that you see, and we create a narrow side that will only accept the smaller ampacity breakers. So by not only having wider enclosures, 42 inches wide and 44 inches wide, respectively, for these two interiors, by offsetting the bus stack, we are able to accommodate those large ampacity breakers. For example, look over at the HCP illustration. Everything from the L frame all the way up through the P frame breaker, they only mount on that wide side. And we talked about a lot of restrictions that our competitors have. And really the one true restriction that I-Line does have is that high ampacity breakers, large frame breakers, will only fit on the wide side of these two interiors. They will not physically fit on the narrow side of either one of these enclosures. So now as we look at both of these illustrations, and we looked at the left-hand side where the arrows are pointing again, and we see 1/2 total breaker mounting space on each side, that information becomes very critical for these wide side interiors because I can only mount the high ampacity large frame breakers on 1/2 of the interior. If we focus in on the HCP, notice now in the in the horizontal rectangle at the bottom, we can now bump up to a 1200 amp main lug and main breaker. And one reason that we encourage people to talk about wide side versus narrow side on these illustrations, as opposed to easily saying left and right side here on the HCM, is if you look at all of these illustrations, they're shown bottom feed. So let's look at this HCM. It's shown bottom feed. If my customer wanted to make it top feed, I merely flip it over. The left and right side are symmetrical, so I can still talk about a left and right side. But if I jump back over here to this HCP interior, it's shown bottom feed as well, but if I flip it over, now the wide side's on the other side, the narrow side's on the other side, and if you start talking left and right, you might get a little bit mixed up. And that's why we've always encouraged people, when you're on these two interiors, specifically talk about a wide side versus a narrow side. The one thing I want to point out on the HCR-U is notice that in the verbiage at the top, it says universal mains. And the reason that it says universal mains is notice in that illustration, there is no horizontal rectangle at the bottom of the illustration like we've seen in the other three panel boards. That's because there is no such thing as a vertically mounted main for this HCR-U interior. Every main for an HCR-U is going to be a back-fed device. It's going to be branch mounted like we saw earlier in those photographs. It's going to be branch mounted and it's going to be back-fed. So as we look at this illustration for an HCR-U, let's say that that is our customer's application. That's all of the breakers that my customer wants. Well, most likely that R frame down in the lower left-hand corner is going to serve as the back-fed main. And you probably see why we list the smaller ampacity breakers at the top, because when we get into these two interiors, we just start stacking those larger ampacity, larger frame breakers at the bottom. But to my point, if this was a top feed panel, if this HCR-U was a top feed panel as opposed to a bottom feed panel, that R frame breaker that's shown at the bottom can be mounted anywhere, top to bottom, but it has to be mounted on that wide side interior. 1200 amp maximum main lug or main breaker. So back to our point with the HCR-U, if it was a main lug device, then we would take a sub-feed lug kit and we would back feed it as the main. 44 inches wide, so this is the largest interior that we make in I-line panel board construction.